Inside Outreach podcast. This is Taron Epps Jr., and I'm joined here by Jessica Garvin, Senator from Oklahoma. I really appreciate you joining me for this.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation.
Of course. So here in the last few months, we've had the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and it's opened up a lot of conversation. I want to ask you some questions about how this affects Oklahomans and how this affects people in general.
Okay.
First question is, the Senate or the Supreme Court overturned this ruling. What does that mean? Does that mean that there's a federal law in state, or does that mean that it's just delegated to the states? What does that mean?
Yeah, so the overturning of Roe versus Wade is obviously extremely momentous for this country. It's created a lot of division, but I think of it as before it was overturned, there was still a lot of division on the issue. It was just kind of flip-flopped into who was quote unquote winning or being the winner in this movement of being pro-life or pro-choice. And so the overturn of Roe versus Wade simply puts that back into the states. The Constitution specifically does not mention abortion or the ability to have an abortion. And so, we're told through our founding fathers that any decision that was not already decided for us in the Constitution would be left up to the states. And for so long, this has been something that the federal government has just come in and said, this is the way it's going to be. Women have the right to their medical privacy. And so they can make whatever decisions they want to based on that medical privacy. And so the overturning of Roe versus Wade and recognizing that it doesn't specifically address that in the U.S. Constitution allows the states to make their own policy decisions related to the abortion or the lack thereof.
Okay. For Oklahoma, has there been any comprehensive legislation that has pertained to abortion?
Yes. So I've been in the Capitol for 2 years. This is my first term. I just finished my second session, second regular session. And we passed, I think, 5 or 6 bills just this session. There were more last year. And really, the legislative intent behind all of that policy is to stop abortions from happening. Unfortunately, this is such a social issue. And, I tell people often, you can't be on the right or the wrong side of something that's a social issue because everyone feels passionate about their stance. And so for those who tend to be more progressive, they consider abortions healthcare or healthcare services, a surgical procedure. Whereas people who are on the conservative side, like myself, we see that as abortion really being the murder of an innocent child. And so a lot of people are somewhere in the middle. I think most people in Oklahoma specifically, when you look at data, a lot of people believe in exclusions for things like rape or incest, life of the mother. My dad is a physician, and he and I have had so many conversations about the life of the mother and what that really means and how often that really happens. And I know that that's a very minute percentage of pregnancies compared to how many pregnancies we have in the state and the nation. But the other things you look at, like rape, we have to find some sort of common ground between and compassion between a woman who had that decision taken from her and someone who doesn't. And so it's a very, very divisive issue, obviously. But again, it puts that back into the state's hands, which is what we've been trying to do as conservatives for such a long time. And so there has been a lot of policy that's addressed it. The abortion issue, some of those have been found unconstitutional based on Roe versus Wade.
Right.
So I think now what we have to do is look through all of the policy that's been passed in the last 10, 15, 20 years and decide, and even more recently than that, obviously, and look and say, okay, well, now that the Supreme Court has recognized that this is not in our Constitution, where do we go from here? the policy that's already been passed. Is it constitutional? Is it not? And really make sense of everything that we've done in the state of Oklahoma. And I think it looks the same for every state.
Yeah. So when you're looking at the legislation, obviously there's different feelings on what happens in these other than normal circumstances where we're talking about rape or you're talking about a disease, or are there implementations in the legislation that are going to facilitate abortion in those cases, or is it just all comprehensive?
Yeah, so that's I think what's really confusing to a lot of people is that there have been legislative measures that have passed, that have been signed into law, that do address exclusions for rape, incest, and life of the mother. There's some that have just only addressed life of the mother. There's some that have not addressed anything at all. And so with the overturning of Roe versus Wade, I think we've got to look at that policy and determine what is truly in effect in the state of Oklahoma currently, and are there any changes that we need to make?
Yeah, I think that if you're going to have those legislative, if you're going to make some legislation, and you know more about this than I do, is that there's always a caveat and exceptions to that rule. When you look at it from a standpoint of now we've just done away with abortions, and now we're looking at expanding maybe our adoption and the foster care system. Are we able to look at ways to put money and resources towards those kind of those options, right?
Yeah.
Abortion, adoption, and
Sure.
foster care.
Yeah, so we've passed legislation in the last 2 years that I've been here that addresses tax credits for adoptive families and foster families. There have been incentives for individuals that are adopting. I think something that's really important for people to know and understand is there's no cost to adopt a child out of foster care in Oklahoma. I mean, of course, you don't have to hire an attorney. I mean,
Right.
obviously, there's costs associated with bringing a child into the world, or adopting a child through, another family or another parent. But we have so many kids in foster care right now who have rights terminated by their biological parents who need good homes, and the state pays for that. And so private adoptions, absolutely. I mean, there are processes that you go through, the legal process, attorneys. There are people who do overseas adoptions. A lot of that, it's private business, and unfortunately we don't have any control over what rates people set for being an attorney in a private adoption, or if someone is a surrogate, or whatever that looks like. I mean, there are private businesses, unfortunately, that do benefit, and they sometimes, and I'm not saying it happens in Oklahoma, but I know that there are other places where people adopt children and they spend their whole life savings on that. But there are kids in the system in DHS custody who have no forever home, and that doesn't cost a family anything to adopt. And so I think that that's, again, something that's really important for people to understand is if you're looking to foster or if you're looking to adopt, we have great kids in care right now that really need a good home. And and the state is very supportive of those adoptions. Now, I think that there's more that we can do for people who choose private adoptions, but we have passed some meaningful legislation that will help those families with the costs associated with adoption if they do choose a private adoption.
How do we entice more families to adopt? Because if you're expanding that foster care and adoption center, that foster care and adoption system, it's gonna grow, and it's gonna cost more resources.
Sure.
And so how do you entice more families to adopt?
So this is just my personal story. I'll share it with you because I think it really, I think the conversation needs to shift, and that's just my personal opinion. So when my husband and I got married, we were 20. I think I was 21. He was 23. We were not ready to have a child. I was on birth control. We got pregnant about 6 or 7 months after we got married. not planned pregnancy at all, and I was not sure that I wanted to be a parent. But for me, abortion wasn't even a consideration. It wasn't something that was ever even a thought to me. But the reason is because I had a spouse whom I loved very deeply, and I knew that he was committed to making a family work. Yeah. I had a very solid family support system and a friend support system, people that could help me raise a child. I had good health care. I had a place to call home that I owned. I had a reliable vehicle. I had a steady job. So I had all of the resources that I felt a child would need. Now, people always say, if you ever wait to have children until you're ready, you'll never have kids, right? Because you don't know what to prepare for.
Right.
But what I had that's a lot different from a lot of women and families in Oklahoma are all of the support system features that need to be there and strong when you have a child. And so I think that we're looking at this all wrong. I think instead of saying, well, now that we can't have abortions, we're going to have a ton of kids in foster care and we need to expand those services. Okay. I think we need to look at it as, if a woman gets pregnant and she's not planning for it and she wants desperately to keep that child but feels inadequate or feels unprepared, what can we do for that family, or what can we do for that woman to prepare her or to prepare these parents for a child? How can we help them with housing? How can we help them with a steady job, with education, with health care, all of these factors that they need to raise a child? Because so many people look at an unplanned pregnancy and think, well, I can't be a parent because I don't have a good enough job, or I don't have good health care insurance, or I don't have a reliable vehicle to get them to and from daycare. Maybe I don't have daycare. Right. So what do we need to do to help bridge those gaps with the families who do get pregnant, that do have an unplanned pregnancy, so that they can be successful? Yeah. Our child, Brooks, he's 11 now, he's healthy, he's ornery, but he's smart and he's loved, and he had everything that he ever needed because we just figured it out. Yeah. But so many people don't or can't figure it out because they don't have the resources. And so I think that we really just need to shift the conversation from, oh crap, what do we do now, to, okay, let's support these women, let's support these families and help them be successful.
How are we gonna, so I understand what you're saying, how are we gonna get to that point where we can provide those resources? Because we both know resources cost money. Mm-hmm. So is there a reallocation of funds to maybe a new legislation that'll help with that? Is that a creation of maybe another department? What does that look like?
I don't know. I think that it's going to take a lot of really smart people figuring it out. I have an interim study this session looking at making Oklahoma a better state for women. Mm-hmm. Education, jobs and economy, healthcare, those are factors in this study. So I think we have to chip away at it. And unfortunately, because of the timing of Roe versus Wade overturning, we don't have an overnight fix.
Right.
And so it is going to look a lot like a roller coaster probably for a little while, but we've got to look at what we're doing wrong and fix that a little at a time. We've got to diversify our economy. We have to bring in new revenue streams. We've been so heavily dependent on the oil and gas industry for so long, right. And we all know what happens whenever that crashes or when it comes back up. Right. Fortunately, the legislature over the last couple of years have put a substantial amount of money in savings for when that happens, but that doesn't help us with new revenue streams. Right. And so we've got to get in a comfortable place where we're not cutting core services when the economy crashes. We have to bring in new revenue streams, and we've got to do our research.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting conversations that are happening about those resources and how to put those things into place to make sure that we have those resources for people. Mm-hmm. What do you think about the argument of this is an autonomy issue? We've heard that especially in Oklahoma over the last 2 years
Yeah.
when it comes to the mask, right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
So how do you feel about it from an autonomy perspective?
That's a really good question, and I don't know that anyone really has an answer, as even me. So I have a really hard time picking and choosing when to apply bodily autonomy. We have a lot of the same people who are saying that we shouldn't be able to make a medical decision. I say medical decision in quotations,
Right.
but a medical decision to have an abortion, and those same people, because of medical privacy, but then those same people are saying, I don't want vaccines because my body, my choice. And so that's something that's really confusing, is I think that for the people who are saying my body, my choice when it comes to vaccines, but not my body, my choice when it comes to abortion,
Right.
and the people, and you flip it, the people who are saying my body, my choice about abortions are a lot of the same people saying, no, you don't have a choice, you have to get vaccinated.
Right, right.
You can't have it both ways.
Right.
And so there has to be some sort of happy medium. And I'm not saying I'm pro-vaccine or pro-abortion or anti-anything. What I'm saying is our country is so divided, and those are two very common issues that we talk about when it comes to bodily autonomy. And especially to your point, the last couple of years with COVID-19 and the injections and immunizations and all of that.
Right.
So how do you find that common ground?
Yeah.
And that is, I don't claim to know everything. I don't have all the answers, but that's what I think for me, that's really what the question is. And I haven't answered it yet, is how do you satisfy having bodily autonomy and being able to make your own medical decisions? And for a lot of people who say, well, abortion affects another life. And so that's not a fair my body, my choice, because that infant, that child doesn't have a choice in the matter. And for me, that's where I am, is, I feel like that unborn child has just as much right to bodily autonomy as the woman. So it's a really slippery slope. I mean, I know that doesn't really answer your question, and that's me being a typical politician and running around the answer, but I don't know that there really is an answer. I mean, I don't know if you've heard of the phrase wicked problem, but a wicked problem is something that there's really no solution or answer to, or nothing definitive. And I think that this is just one of those wicked problems that we really don't have an answer. And I don't know how to get there. I don't know what the path is to get there.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot to consider, and I don't think we always consider all sides of the argument when we talk about these, or when we have these discussions.
Right.
I want to ask, is there any fear, not even fear, but is there any thoughts going through your head of there's some federal legislation that gets put in place about abortion?
Sure.
Is there any fear that this could be temporary? Some state legislation could be temporary if they go federal. I mean, there's a lot of calls for federal legislation.
Yeah.
There was calls before Roe v. Wade was overturned, and there's definitely calls from now. So is there any fear that maybe we can put some things into place here in Oklahoma, and there's going to be back in D.C. they're going to make a all comprehensive abortion plan?
Sure. Yeah. So that's a really good question. I think it'll probably we'll start to see more abortion legislation being pushed through. I think there's going to be a big shift in what we see, who we see in the White House, what we see as far as Congress and the Senate. And so I don't know that the pro-choice movement will really get legislation through. But with the overturn of Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court recognized this is a state's issue. It's not addressed in the Constitution. And so my assumption would be, if there were legislation that gets passed through the legislature, that somebody would file a lawsuit and it'd go right back to the Supreme Court to say, hey, this isn't a federal issue, this is a state's issue. Oh. And so it's not something that I worry about. I'm sure it's going to happen. We'll probably go down that road at some point, but I think the bigger picture here is the Supreme Court has recognized this should have never been a federal issue in the first place. And so I don't think that the Supreme Court would allow for it to continue to be a federal issue after they've already turned at the opposite direction and said this is a state's issue.
Yeah. I wanna close out on a question. I think it's on a lot of people's minds, especially in the progressive world, is that there's kind of this thought process that the overturning on Roe v. Wade is the a slippery slope, right? There's abortion, and then it might lead to same-sex marriage laws and transgender laws. What's your thoughts on that? Do you think it stops at abortion? This is the conversation, or are we going to get to contraceptives, same-sex marriage?
Yeah. So our state, Oklahoma, we've already passed same-sex marriage. That was a state's issue. It's already passed. It's allowed in Oklahoma. And so I think these things that people are viewing as a slippery slope, a lot of states are already addressing them, and they've already determined what's going to be legal or illegal in their states. Okay. So could it cause potentially someone to go back and try to change the state constitution to get rid of same-sex marriage or to add same-sex marriage? Probably. I mean, it would probably entice people to do that. But like I said, a lot of states have already determined the eligibility for marriage legally. You know, there's those of us who, again, for me being on the conservative side, I have my personal opinions about marriage and what that looks like. You know, but the reality is, I'm not called to judge people. I'm called to love people. And, you know, people don't always agree with my personal choices. I don't always agree with theirs, but I'm called to be like Christ. And, you know, he always says, or he said in the Bible, cast the first stone. Yeah. And so, you know, I think we've got to get to a point where we start to look past all of these social issues like same-sex marriage and abortion and just realize, like, we're called to be followers of Christ. We're called to be lovers of people. And so that's really what the root is, and the solution is to just let God take care of that. And I'm sorry to get all, you know, all preachy on you, I guess, but as someone that is just very firm in my faith, I just believe that a lot of these things that we see as social issues are really God issues, and we need to let Him take care of that stuff because that's His job. So I say that just to say, you know, you can't legislate morality. Right. My hope is that state legislature in Oklahoma and state legislatures in other states make these a state issue like they should be, like they have been, and allow their people to decide. And at the end of the day, God will take care of whatever is right or wrong. That's not up to me. Right. I can't continue to try to legislate morality. And I think, unfortunately, we have people in elected positions that really are truly there for the political pandering of their constituents, and they're there for the political pandering of whichever party they associate with. But at the end of the day, the people who are really good legislators, the people who are really good representatives or senators of their districts, and the governor and lieutenant governor, those are people that really look at public policy and how it impacts people's lives. Yeah. So there are so many of us who are not here for the political pandering. Yeah. We'll leave that to other people. Let's look at the policy. And that's why I told you, I think that the shift in mentality needs to, and the shift in the conversation needs to be not focused on, oh great, now everybody's gonna be popping babies out and we don't have adoption or abortion as a choice and all of that. We need to look at it and say, how can we do better for Oklahoma? What can we do better for Oklahoma families that they feel comfortable and confident and safe raising a child in this state? Right. Because that, to me, is what makes a good legislator, when you're looking at the policy and making positive changes versus looking at the overturn of Roe versus Wade in itself and saying, oh, this is devastating for our state, or oh, this is fantastic for our state, and just looking at it and saying, okay, let's fix the issues. Let's let people successfully raise children in Oklahoma, and let's wrap services around them so that they can be successful. Yeah.
You know, that's a lot of good points. Yeah, I think your perspective has been maybe one of the more nuanced. I think you add a lot of gray in a very black and white conversation. Mm-hmm. And that human focus on legislation is something you don't always see from politicians.
Yeah.
So I commend that.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I mean, the reality is, I had a Twitter post a couple of weeks ago and just said, I wish that people on both sides of the aisle would look back and realize that a week ago they were on the other side. So we had people who were pro-choice who were always boasting and bragging and kind of rubbing it in people's face that we're a pro-choice country. And there were broken hearts of maybe parents who want to adopt and they see all of these abortions happening, or people who are very strong in their faith and believe because of their faith that is murder. Or whatever the case is, you had people who had broken hearts about it, and then you had people who were rejoicing. Well, now those people who were broken are now rejoicing, and then the people who were rejoicing are now broken. And so that's where that human element has to come in and say, hey, listen, we're not going to agree on this at all, obviously. But let's take this, whether you see it as negative or positive, let's take this situation and let's make it better for our state. And I think that's just a really important thing that we've got to do.
No, that makes perfect sense. Senator Jessica Garvin, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. I get called all sorts of things.
I really appreciate you doing this with us, and I really appreciate you being a part of this conversation and being open to having a conversation.
Yeah, well, thank you for your time and for driving up here. And
no problem.